Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Mike Prysner, who joined the Army 3 months before the 9/11 attacks, and in March 2003 was part of the invasion of Iraq. After 12 months in the occupation, he became an outspoken opponent of the war and became known for speeches, protests, and veterans organizing against U.S. imperialism. Since 2015, he has been the producer and co-writer for Abby Martin's show, The Empire Files, and is also the host of Eyes Left, a socialist anti-war military podcast. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So it is actually the Eyes Left podcast that I wanted to bring up. Because you just came out with a very powerful and, in fact, damning episode titled Ron DeSantis' Military Secrets, Torture, and War Crimes. And folks can take a listen to that episode over at SoundCloud after the show. But Mike, I wanted to start off with actually a little bit of what you started off with in your show, the juxtaposition of reality versus this like Top Gun fan fiction that DeSantis seems to be living in. So if you go to his site, which I'm not recommending anybody do, you'll see a picture of him in his Navy uniform and information in his About section, reading that he was a Navy JAG officer deployed to Iraq. He got a Bronze Star Medal, and that's pretty much that. So before we get to the lying by gross omission, can you tell listeners what a Navy JAG officer is, and perhaps what their supposed role is versus what their role is in practice?
Sure. Well, yeah, the podcast is also available at any streaming app. I know a lot of people don't use SoundCloud these days, but you can find it anywhere. But yeah, so a JAG is the Judge Advocate General Corps. It's the military has its own legal system, Uniform Code of Military Justice. So if you break the law and you're in the military, you get tried in a military court instead of in a civilian court. And if given you commit a crime in the military and not, a DUI out in the streets or something. But anyways, the judge, there's no jury. There's just a officer who's the judge and the jury and all of that. So there's a legal system that exists within the military. And that has a lot of like domestic use of actually prosecuting service members for things that they do in the military that are illegal. And there's military jails, and it's that whole legal system within. But they also play a role overseas on deployments of kind of ensuring compliance with military law, local law, international law, and things like that. There's police, there's investigators, there's a whole internal legal system for the military. The thing that's interesting about DeSantis is, he may have done a little of that boring stuff, of the working in the courts, the JAG courts in the US and all that. People may remember the JAG TV show throughout the 90s, which, they did a lot of shooting with guns, which is not what they do, but, they're in the courtroom all the time doing military trials and stuff. The thing that made me interested in this story is that when you look into DeSantis's military history, because he does tout it, he shows the pictures and all of that stuff, there's really nothing there. It's very shadowy. And so you could assume, it's because he's had a boring career and all he did was sit behind a desk and do pencil pushing, which he did for the first couple years in the Navy, doing like drug test administration and stuff like that. But then we know that he served at Guantanamo Bay and we served in Iraq. And, there's really no reporting on this. When he ran for governor for the first time in 2018, there was a little bit of reporting on this stuff. Some Florida press went to find out, what did he do in Guantanamo? What did he do in Iraq? So they've got some military records, and they interviewed people that were his superiors in both places. And the reason I started digging into this is because it just took what they said at face value. When you look at what he did in Guantanamo, it just says in Guantanamo Bay, he was the JAG officer responsible for ensuring the human rights of detainees and that the U.S. was in compliance with international law. You look up what he did in Iraq, and it's the same thing. He was advising special operations on being in compliance with international law. Now, if anyone knows anything about the places he was at the times that he was, that can't really be true. He was in Guantanamo Bay in 2006. When he was supposedly ensuring the U.S. complied with international law. 2006 was the height of the Bush torture program, where we know that the U.S. was not in compliance with international law, but it was never questioned that that's what he was doing. Same thing with Iraq. He was in Iraq at the height of the troop surge in 2007, the deadliest year of the war for the U.S., but also for Iraqis, and advising special operations, which do a lot of extra legal shady stuff. So I was confronted with that. He has this, what is said that he did, and then what is highly unlikely that really happened.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into how you happened upon this story, but I also just wanted to give folks a heads up that we will be discussing torture. So please be advised. But your podcast, I want to get into the horror show a little bit here, because it basically breaks this down through some really powerful investigative journalism about how DeSantis was at Guantanamo Bay before he was deployed to Iraq. And in fact, it doesn't even mention Guantanamo Bay on his website. Mm-hmm. It just mentions Iraq. And as you noted, he was there during the height of this horrific torture program, which was later revealed, and that he not only partook in the torture, but in a way facilitated worse torture through deception. Can you share a little bit about those points without, giving away your entire podcast, but a little bit about those points that are not discussed?
Yeah. So up until now, all that was known about his service in Guantanamo was that he was this attorney who is responsible for ensuring U.S. compliance with international law. That's all that was known. DeSantis, it's not on his website, but he does mention it, and he has mentioned it throughout the years, usually in the context of advocating against the closure of Guantanamo. So when Obama was president and he was in Congress, he would constantly tout his quote unquote service at Guantanamo as, I'm an expert and I know that these people are animals and we can't release them or close Guantanamo Bay or whatever. So he has mentioned it, but of course, never given specifics about what he actually did. And so given the time that he was there, I knew that there clearly had to be more to the story. And so I tracked down someone who was a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay, a man named Mansour Adayfi. He was one, most of the prisoners at Guantanamo had never committed a crime. There were people like Mansour, people that were kidnapped by Afghan warlords and just sold to the United States for like these false, fraudulent terrorist bounties, because the CIA was like, give us your Al-Qaeda, we'll give you a bunch of money. And so they just rounded up political opponents or just random teenagers and then sold them to the United States for a bunch of money. So Mansour was one of these people, as were many at Guantanamo, but has since been released. He was at Guantanamo Bay imprisoned from 2002 to 2016, so a decent chunk of his life. And he said that a couple things that are revealing about what DeSantis did. I mean, first of all, the human rights lawyer thing, that was his official role, and that is what he told detainees when he got to Guantanamo Bay in March of 2006. In 2005 and in 2006, there was huge protests at Guantanamo Bay because for the people there, not only had they committed no crime, they were being brutally tortured and beaten up and harassed, and the religion violated, like desecration of the Quran and all these things that were just huge outrages and war crimes. And of course, none of them thought they were ever going to leave, because that was the plan of the U.S. It was indefinite detention without charge or trial. So they all assumed we're just going to be here for the rest of our lives under this kind of treatment. So there was lots of protests and uprisings, but also hunger strikes, which is like a main form of resistance. And torture at this time was a huge scandal for the United States. I mean, the United Nations in 2006 ruled that Guantanamo needed to be closed because it was in violation of international law. And so the hunger strike was very damaging to the United States because it helped keep it in the international spotlight. And so a bunch of officers were brought in to break the hunger strike. So a new wave of positions came in specifically to crush the resilience of the demonstrators or the protesters and the hunger strikers. DeSantis seems to have been one of those people, because this human rights lawyer job wasn't one that existed, that they just switched it. Some guy's tour was over and then DeSantis came and replaced him. DeSantis shows up at Guantanamo Bay, according to Mansour, and says, I'm here to ensure your human rights are respected. And all the detainees said, oh my God, that's amazing. Like our protests are working. And finally, someone is going to hear our legal grievances. So DeSantis meets with people. He talks to all the prisoners, finds out what is impacting them the most, finds out what they believe are the violations of their human rights. And instead of ensuring that their human rights and international law are upheld, he then tells the prison administrator so that they can increase all of the things that were impacting people more. Things like sleep deprivation, like noise in the night. They told him it's violation of our rights to have so much noise so that we can't sleep, intentional noise, we can't sleep. So he says, okay, and then goes, and then they just bring in more things that make noise throughout the night. So that's just one example, but there are many. So it seemed that his role was to actually aid in maximizing the impact of the torture. The other piece of it that I think really needs to be dug into more, and that other journalists should confront him on more, is that Mansour said that DeSantis wasn't just playing this good cop role. Initially he did, but then he was present for torture. He was present for beatings, in particular force feedings. Now, this was a mechanism they used to crush the hunger strike, is they would force feed people. It's pretty gruesome. I won't go into the details. The details are in the podcast. And I think they're important because it speaks to DeSantis's sadism. But while Mansour was being force fed and, you're defecating yourself, you're vomiting, he's screaming, he's crying. It's extremely painful. And DeSantis was there in the room while he was being force fed. And he told me that he looked at DeSantis while all this is happening and said, look at what they're doing to us. This is how we're being treated. This is torture. And he said DeSantis was laughing during the procedure. And when Mansour said to him, you need to help me, he smiled at him, smiling, and said, maybe you should just eat then and break the hunger strike. So that was his experience with DeSantis. And, there's more details I won't get into, but it wasn't just Mansour. He told me that DeSantis was kind of notorious at the prison. He said that when you're living through a situation like that, you're dealing with so many people who are abusing you every day. You can't remember everyone. It's all just a blur. He told me you remember the people who are good to you and treat you humanely. You always remember those people, and you remember the worst of the worst. And he said DeSantis is someone that everybody remembers because he was considered one of the worst of the worst.
Yeah, and the interview that you have with Mansour on your podcast, for folks listening, I highly recommend it because it's a very important, as you pointed out, it's a very important interview to hear. And I'm curious, because this information is not, shared on his website, of course, and things like that, but how difficult was it for you to find? Is it out there? Is it public record? Or how much did you have to really dig to find this information?
Yeah, so it's really all from his 2018 gubernatorial run. I mean, there was some report because he used, his military service in his campaigning, just like he did in 2022, but for a military service he wasn't in, the whole Air Force ad, Top Gov. So, there was there's little pieces of it there, and his statements in the past in Congress. So yeah, and the Iraq thing is even more mysterious because there's no witnesses to what he did there. But I think there's some important things to consider, and hopefully some other journalist works on this as well. The first thing is, why was it he was sent to Guantanamo? Because if you're going to be sent as a human rights lawyer at a time when the United States knows and wants to continue committing violations of international and human rights abuses. I mean, they weren't trying to be in compliance. They wanted to continue the torture program and all of that. You're not just going to risk sending any Yale and Harvard educated, new, young, ambitious lawyer to Guantanamo to say your job's to uphold human rights and then have them get there and say, oh my God, you're torturing people. This is, obviously DeSantis was picked because they trusted him. And they felt that he fit the mold of what they needed, someone who is going to be, not just okay with the torture, but be okay with aiding and assisting it. And even, as Mansour describes, taking pleasure in it. So there had to have been, because he was a low-ranking officer at the time. So there must have been some kind of, they must have trusted him to be in alliance with the Bush administration and the torture program. So then he does this job at Guantanamo. He's there for 10 months. And plays this role of crushing the strike and letting the administrators do whatever they wanted and know that they're going to get legal cover from DeSantis. Right after that assignment, which is his first real assignment, his 2 years in the Navy, he goes straight from Guantanamo to Iraq. So that would indicate that they were impressed with the job he did, and they sent him to do the same thing in Iraq. Similar to Guantanamo, it's a very important time and place. It's 2007. As I said, the height of the troop surge, when it was really for the United States, it was like, we need to win the war now by any means necessary, or we're going to be embarrassed. And this is going to be a huge disaster. So the pressure on commanders to do whatever gets results, regardless of what it means legally, was huge at the time. He sent to Fallujah and Anbar province, which is like the center of the resistance. And he's with special operations, Navy SEALs and Army Green Berets, and doing the same job of advising legally. Now, I also interviewed someone in that podcast who worked in special operations and infantry operations, where he was present for a lot of these special forces raids. And he told me, and I've also had this corroborated by other former special forces people, it's that the job of the JAG officer is not to be like, hey, don't torture that guy, or hey, don't kill those civilians. It's to provide top cover for the commanders and the soldiers. If anything illegal does happen, that they make sure that they help keep them out of trouble. And that's kind of what they're known for doing, the JAG officers there overseas. I mean, that's not their official title, but just like Guantanamo, the official title is very different from what you're actually doing. So we don't know exactly what he was doing there, but I think there's definitely more to be discovered. But you can assume, based on what we know about him at Guantanamo, you can kind of draw your own conclusions about the kind of things he did in Iraq as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, like, in terms of, you mentioned that he was not a very high-ranking officer, and I'm curious about the hierarchies here and how this would potentially connect to the U.S. judicial system, or perhaps even an international judicial system like The Hague. What is the connection between like the military judicial system and the U.S. judicial system? And is there a crossover if there's something egregious that hypothetically the U.S. would want to have their hands in? Not that I'd necessarily think that the U.S. empire would want to do that, but what is the connection there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just, there's not a connection. And so, when the few soldiers that have been charged with war crimes, they're always tried in military courts. They're never tried in U.S. civilian court, and the U.S. doesn't let them be tried in local courts of the country that committed the war crimes, which was one of the big points of contention at the end of the Iraq War, when the U.S. was negotiating a status of forces agreement. After the WikiLeaks releases and the collateral murder video, Iraqi government said, well, if you're going to stay here, you have to be tried in our courts when you murder civilians. So yeah, the problem is there's just groups like special operations. There's just so much legal impunity that even when people get caught, there's all and for doing crimes, I mean, there's all these ways they're protected legally when, in a civilian court, they wouldn't be. I mean, you murder someone in a civilian court, they throw the book at you, and it's hard to get away with it if they know that you did it. And military courts, it's a little different. So it's very rare that there are war crimes trials in military courts for soldiers. It's always when it's something so egregious that like other soldiers report them, or it's someone blows the whistle and pictures and video and stuff gets out. And I'll remind you that there were several war crimes prosecutions from Iraq and Afghanistan, people like Eddie Gallagher, and Trump just pardoned them all on his way out. All the most heinous, just straight up murderers of women and children for fun, Trump let all those people out. And so those are kind of the rare cases that people are tried in military courts for stuff like this.
So in that sense, there's this feeling that even if DeSantis were to admit it, even gleefully, there's a question of what would happen to him in the context of a nation where torture is the status quo. I mean, in your podcast, you mentioned Article 3 of the Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners of war. And there isn't one line, if folks look at the Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, there isn't one line of it that DeSantis and the U.S. empire as a whole hasn't flouted. Humane treatment, prohibition of cruel treatment and torture, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the feeling that that someone like DeSantis could ever be brought to justice? I mean, is there even a statute of limitations on Article 3, and how would that work?
Yeah, well, you bring up an important point. Nobody has ever been punished for the war crimes at Guantanamo Bay, and there's definitely a lot of people that should be, starting with the top prison administrators, the generals who ran the prison and implemented the torture and experimentation and all that. So there's a lot there. And it's the fact that you brought up Article 3. I mean, it's funny because DeSantis's former colleagues and superiors who gave those glowing interviews to the Florida press about what a great job he did at Guantanamo may have been unknowingly implicating him in the crimes, because they said the Article 3 came from his former boss, saying he was in charge of ensuring human rights. In particular, he was charged with enforcing Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. So he gave a very specific thing that we now know DeSantis very specifically violated and facilitated. So, it's a little piece of evidence that maybe in a perfect world would be used at some kind of trial one day. I don't believe there's a statute of limitations in international courts because, people who are now in their old age ended up being charged there for things they did in their youth. But does DeSantis deserve to be charged? And, I think that of course, it's one of those things that it's like starting at the top and the generals and all that stuff makes sense. But if DeSantis had done the things he did as a prison interrogator, as a prison guard, as just one of the jobs that hundreds of people cycle in and out to do, that would be bad enough. The fact that he did it as the human rights legal advisor, that he wasn't just someone who he can't use the excuse, I didn't know the law, I didn't know that what we were doing was torture, I was just following orders. His job was to keep everyone else in line in compliance with international law. His job was to know officially that this was torture, this was a violation of international law. So I think DeSantis, more than anybody involved, bears a culpability that you could easily make a case as criminal at The Hague. Will he be charged? So, I mean, if there's a revolution of some kind, yes. But I think the important thing is that he's wanted to hide from this past, because the fact that he has never given details about what he did in Iraq or what he did at Guantanamo, he's never given any indication of what he did there. That means that he doesn't want this stuff to be out because he feels it could be damning, because torture was a big issue once in the United States. I mean, Obama's ascendance in the primary and victory in the 2008 election, he had the strongest position against torture and was calling to close Guantanamo Bay. It was such a scandal. People really did care deeply about it. And I think since Obama came in and outlawed waterboarding and certain things like that, I mean, I feel like it disappeared as an issue, but justice has never really happened. And there's still people there who shouldn't be. And there's still people like Mansour who have never gotten justice, and still people who are perpetrators of the crimes that have never had to answer for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in particular with The Hague, the U.S. actually has a Hague Invasion Act that is law that basically dictates that if anybody were ever to be taken to The Hague, anybody that the U.S. empire cares about, they would be allowed to invade the Netherlands and get them back. So that's how much our country respects the International Criminal Court.
So DeSantis feels pretty safe, I'm sure.
Yeah, right.
Sort of war over.
And so I also wanted to ask, because this was something that I found really interesting, because I have basically no experience with the military personally. You mentioned in the podcast that even in basic training, you're taught ways around the Geneva Convention. And this is, basically for people that I take it that you were not involved in the military courts, but you're taught that this is the law, and this is basically how to finagle, worm your way around it. And so I feel like, along with the millions of lives that are ruined by U.S. imperialism, there's so many Americans that are being morally, mentally, and emotionally broken down in order to commit these atrocities. And I feel like you do a lot of this kind of outreach and activism, reaching out to people who are in the military or have recently left. Where do you feel like we can break this cycle so that either people like DeSantis don't come into places of power if they're just sociopathic in general, or that we can stop people from being turned into these like Batman style villains in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. And I think that so much of it just rests on what American culture is like. I mean, it's such a culture of military worship. And that has actually changed over the years, in particular in the post 9/11 era, where the military and veterans, it was always there's always this reverence and kneeling at the altar, and you go to SeaWorld and you got to stand and salute the veterans. There's no there's really no escape from it. You know, the Christmas parade in Hollywood here out in LA, it's the Marines are escorting Santa. You know, it's like, what is this? So it's just everywhere. You're really inundated with it. But since 9/11, it's also morphed into this hero worship, specifically with like operators, special operators. And so the image of like the guy with the big beard and the tank top and the ammo vest and the M4 with all the million different things on it. I mean, that's a relatively recent, you know, change in the worship, the military culture that we have in this country. And so it goes beyond just serving in uniform and being on a ship or being a whatever job in the army. It's like being a special operator. And those are the guys that just, like you see in the movies, bust into someone's house in the middle of the night, shoot people in their beds, and snatch someone up and throw them in a Black Hawk. And it becomes this very different kind of thing. And so that is a big draw for people into the military, because they're always, you know, we live in a society that's very alienating. It's very lonely. You don't feel that you can do anything of any significance in your life. I mean, the military preys on that fact that people feel isolated and alone and kind of worthless and not important, and then shows you these images, these characters, these hero archetypes of like, you can just be one of these guys, like, and that would be awesome. And you'll have the best friends, brothers in the military, and you'll do this stuff that's very important. So that's used a lot. And they know that, and they really play on that. So that's something that needs to be broken. I mean, it's also a reason that there's just mass shootings. I mean, this is like obsession with killing as a way of proving yourself. But I am optimistic in the sense that I feel like that's breaking a bit, and it's breaking a bit because the military is in a recruitment crisis right now, like a big recruitment crisis. Like the army wanted 60,000 new soldiers last year, and they got like 40,000. I mean, that's a big historic shortfall. In fact, the biggest shortfall ever since in like modern times. And the number one reason that youth are giving for why they don't want to join the military anymore, it's not because there's more opportunities on the outside or they don't feel as hopeless. It's because there's a growing distrust for the military. And the obsession with how cool it is to be in the military is not working on a younger generation who grew up with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars going on. So it gives me a little bit of hope that something that was such a figure in our society is now seeming to break a little bit. And that's why the Army has switched recently its recruiting tactics to no longer emphasizing the cool guy with a gun thing, but now all their ads are about how, you know, you can go in your spare time, you can go ziplining and to all these cool beaches and like just literally vacation. Like you'll have time to go on vacation is like their new approach. So yeah, it's dark, this topic, but at the same time, there's a lot of hope and optimism. And also the last thing I'll say about it is, through doing this podcast, Eyes Left, I mean, the whole point is to provide an outlet and a space for people who are in the military, who made the mistake of joining and quickly regretted or became politically conscious when they were in, something they can find to reinforce how they're feeling, or to learn more, or to meet other people who think like them. And it's just been such a rewarding experience, because I'm constantly in contact with people who are in the military who joined and then became socialists or left-wing or anti-war. And there's way more than people think in the military. And so it's not just the young people who are turning against the military, not wanting to join, but people who are in, I think, are more politically conscious than at any point in my lifetime.
That is fantastic. And I'm very, very glad to hear it. And I do feel like, as somebody who's organized, not necessarily with military folks, but they've been a part of organizing spaces, I feel like a lot of the youth that I've organized with are very anti-war and have like a great understanding of US imperialism that I definitely didn't have when I was 16.
Yeah. Yeah.
So absolutely. I'm like, awesome. This is great. You're way ahead of where we were at your age.
Yeah.
So finally wrapping up here, I think we can kind of understand, you know, in a sort of journalistic sense, why this story is important and why your reporting is important. But I want to ask you, kind of looking into the future, particularly with your experiences in the military, I've always felt that, you know, neoliberalism paves the road for fascism, and it's the road to fascism. And I always felt that Trump was just a placeholder for somebody who's going to be far more efficient at fascism. And DeSantis really scares me in that sense, because not only is he somebody who's actually been active in the military, which it's been quite a while since we have had a president who has been an active member of the military and really enjoyed it. And so I'm curious, what do you fear could be the outcome if somebody like DeSantis were to sit in the White House? What are your fears with regards to U.S. imperialism?
That's a very important question because you're right. Like Trump clearly had Trump is a right-wing demagogue, the type that fascism grows out of. He did have some basis support in the military. You had your MAGA cultists, loyalists in the military at all echelons. I mean, people like, Michael Flynn's, he's not the only one. There's other officers, and not just enlisted people, but like high-ranking officers, like some of the people that probably helped him out on January 6th and stuff like that. So there was like a faction in the military under Trump that were like Trump loyalists. But also Trump, he also has things that hurt him in that regard, where having a big sector of the military come to his aid to do some really bad stuff. When you have someone, and history is very clear about this, when you have a right-wing demagogue who also has deep ties to the military, and is in fact in the military, like DeSantis, as far as we know, is still in the Navy. As of this year, he was still an officer in the Navy, and I couldn't find anything that said he ended his contract. So as of this year, he was still a Navy officer. And not only that, but unlike Trump, deep ties to the military establishment. I mean, the fact that he was part of the cover-up of the Bush torture program. I mean, the connections and the loyalties that he's gotten and all of that in this like neoconservative military establishment, those connections are very real. He's close with things like the Heritage Foundation, which was like the brains of the two Gulf Wars, of Iraq War I and the invasion of Iraq, and George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. I mean, he has these connections and is one of those people. And so the scary thing about DeSantis is his political program, his politics are identical to Trump's in the domestic sphere. The racism, the anti-trans stuff. He is just exactly like Trump on everything, even COVID, even that stuff. He's the same as Trump on everything. And the place that they are different is that he has this very real legacy and connection to the military and a very real like neoconservative worldview. And so, yes, I mean, the danger of DeSantis coming in and being like another George W. Bush in terms of his world, like a Mike Pompeo, because like that's where he is politically on foreign policy, that's very scary. But I think what's even scarier is that trying to become a demagogue like Trump and a same figure with the same type of mass following like Trump, but coupled with the fact that he has this huge connection inside the Pentagon and loyalties inside the military, it could be, I don't want to say like he'd be worse than Trump because they're both terrible. And also they're not going to be running for president against each other. They're just running in a primary supposedly against each other. But it's definitely something that people need to pay attention to DeSantis now and start trying to make this guy's life very hard and make all of these ghosts haunt him, because, it's now that we know these things, it should alarm people a little more about him. And especially for people in Florida, I worry for them, but of course I worry for everyone in the country if he's able to ascend on these things in his past.
Yeah, absolutely. And based on his experience, he has a lot of ghosts that should haunt him.
Mm-hmm.
So Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I just hope people check out this show. We have a lot of back episodes that are great. We just restarted it this Veterans Day after a little break. And so there's a lot of great content there. And I think the important thing is if you know anyone in the military who either that podcast can be a resource for them if they hate the military and regret joining and have different politics now, or if there's people that you feel are reachable. That show's meant to kind of be a tool to reach people who you feel could have these conversations with, but because you don't know anything about the military, you don't feel you can have those conversations. It's frequently used by people with friends and family in the military who want to bring them to a good perspective. And so I hope people take advantage of it.
Yes, I personally shared it with an old guitarist of mine who was a Marine and refused to talk to me because, quote, Eleanor, you just don't get it. And so I shared it with him and I was like, I don't, but he does. And I have to say it was very very powerful, the conversations that we had afterwards. So I can recommend it personally as somebody who's not been in the military, but knows people who has. So Mike, thank you again so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and share this this important story. Everyone go check out the Eyes Left podcast and also the Empire Files, two really great shows.
Thanks, Eleanor.